All right, take two. We're going to reconvene the BBG meeting now for our panel. And the theme of the panel today is perception of the United States throughout the Middle East. Obviously, the Middle East is a critical region, both to the BBG and to the country. And we often hear about our perceptions of the Middle East, but we very rarely hear about the Middle East perceptions of us. So my fellow board member, Ambassador Crocker, had suggested that we have a panel to help us understand a little bit of different perspective before we hear from Brian and his team later on in the morning. So I'm thrilled. Brian's going to introduce the panel, but I'm thrillid that the two gentlemen could make it here with us today. Obviously, it's important to inform the governors as we do our work, and it's great. So it's my pleasure to introduce my fellow governor and Ambassador Ryan Crocker. Ryan, take it away.
Well, thank you, Governor Schell. We're very pleased to have this opportunity with two of the major figures in Arabic language journalism, both television and print media. On my far left, very appropriately, is Hisham Melhem, the Washington bureau chief of Al-Arabiya, the satellite station based in Dubai that covers the region and indeed the world. Hisham got his college degree in philosophy here in the U.S. at Villanova, and has been recognized as an exceptional alumni of that university. He studied philosophy at Georgetown at the doctoral level, and has written for more publications than I can count, including exceptional Lebanese newspapers such as Es-Safir and Nahar, for which Hisham still writes. He has conducted a number of interviews. Most notably, I think, he conducted the first interview, television interview with President Obama just a few days after his inauguration in 2009. Not the first interview by an Arabic network, the first television interview, period. To my immediate left is Abderrahim Foukara, the Washington bureau chief of Al-Jazeera International, born in Morocco, moved to the UK, where he received a PhD in African studies.
A long time ago.
Go figure. Like Hisham, he has experience in both media worlds. He worked for a number of years for BBC, and in this country, he reported for The World, which is a co-production of BBC, Public Radio International, and GWBH in Boston. So again, he's seen it from both sides of the street. He's been with Al-Jazeera since 2002, and all of that, I think, has been here in Washington, right?
And New York.
And New York, right. He has been a guest on a number of shows. He is also the host of Min Washington, From Washington, Polish Up Your Arabic Just a Bit, and you will see some really exciting commentary. Gentlemen, we welcome you both here to the studios of our Middle East broadcasting networks and the home of Al Hurra Television and Al Hurra Iraq Television. We obviously have different perspectives and different aims, and over which I hope we'll have a lively conversation. But we do share some things. One of these is very sad. The perils that all of our journalists have faced. We just remembered at the beginning of our meeting our missing Al Huda journalist Bashir Fahmy in Syria. I know, Abderrahim, that you have 4 incarcerated journalists, unless the number's gone up this morning, in Egypt, at least 3 of whom are facing criminal charges. And Hisham, you have had your colleagues murdered, most recently in Iraq. Journalism is an inherently dangerous business, and whatever our aims and our organizations are, we suffer that common peril. We share something else in common on a slightly lighter note. All 3 of our media apparatuses enjoy government funding. We just happen to be a little bit more open about it than I think you may be. It's kind of interesting, not to start a controversy. I'm sure we'll manage that on our own. Al-Jazeera, of course, was the really the first major satellite network in Arabic that just captured the imagination of Arabic speakers everywhere. Based in Qatar, funded by the Qatari government, and Al-Arabiya, I would say, with the certainty of contradiction, came into being some years later with Saudi support, based just next door in Dubai, at least in large part as a counterweight or antidote to Al Jazeera.
Shocking.
And I actually should be sitting between you. I mean, Chairman Shell noted the incredible tumult going on in the region right now. I don't think we've seen the like of it, not even during the revolutions of the 1950s. Very hard to predict where it's going to go. But I would just like to ask both of you, before I kind of get into how you look at and relate to the United States, how the 3+ years of the so-called Arab Spring have affected your outlook, your coverage, and your operations. And you can take that on in any order you choose.
Thank you, Ambassador Crocker. Thank you all for the invite. And now I know why your ambassador, the diplomatic way you opened with that salvo on funding was just superlative. Thank you very much. Obviously, I think that, speaking for myself, obviously, one of the hardest things that we face as journalists, apart from the perils that you talked about, is to what extent we can report to our audiences dispassionately on what we see and experience in a land far away from them. It was extremely difficult for me personally about 3 years ago when Mubarak stepped down to control my excitement about what that may actually spell, not just for the region, but for the relations of the region with other parts of the world, particularly the United States. I think we all know that by now the euphoria has faded, and we've all come to draw different conclusions. Some of us, depending on what school of thought we subscribe to, some of us are saying this has been a major disappointment. This only goes to confirm what many people have been saying about the Middle East, is that this region will be the last part of the world to democratize. And, others subscribing to a different school saying, what do you expect? This region has known nothing but tyranny for a long, long time, and for it to come to terms with that tyranny is going to take time. It's going to be twists and turns before we finally get to where we need to be. Like you, nobody has a crystal ball which school of thought will prevail at the end of the day. As sad as it is for us to follow events happening in the region, looked at dispassionately, it's also a time of possible excitement about what may happen ultimately beyond the tragedies of Syria, the tragedies of Egypt, Libya, and so on. I think that for us, or for me personally, reporting to my audience in that part of the world from the United States, one of the advantages of doing that is that obviously DC is the one capital that really still matters in that part of the world. The decisions that are made here still matter, whether to ordinary people in the Middle East and North Africa or to policymakers. But I just want to leave you with this thought about the other advantage of living in the United States. Given all the things that are being said now in the Middle East, and perhaps not being said, depending on the circumstance, about constitutions, about multi-party societies where people from different religions, different ethnic groups all get on with it within one same nation, under the same constitution, people having the same rights as well as obligations. The kind of debate that has been happening here in the United States for decades, and which has produced the kind of society that we all know here in this country. It's not perfect. The United States Constitution, and this is something that we try to convey to our viewers, it's not a perfect constitution. There's a big difference between the time it was made and the times that we live in now. But I think the advantage is that we are able to hold up a mirror to our viewers to look at in terms of what they may want to do, what kind of debate they may want to have, and what conclusions they may want to reach themselves about how things here are done, about how things are done here in the United States, and how they affect them in that part of the world.
Thank you. Very eloquently put. And as I turn to Hisham, again, truth in advertising, I have known Hisham for more than 30 years now. Back in the days, we met back in the days of the Civil War in Beirut. And I just mentioned that at the outset before Hisham takes the floor. You know, I know a lot of stuff, Hisham.
I know too. Okay. First, I'd like to thank the governors, and I know one of them, and I miss him in Time magazine, but I'll see if there is life after Time. It's good to be here. This is my first visit. I have too many friends here, even people behind the camera, not only as journalists, so it's nice kind of feeling like going home, although I've never been here before. I'd like to thank Ryan. I call him Ryan because I consider him a close friend. We've known each other forever, and we have a lot in common. Our fascination with Lebanon and our deep cultural, historic interest in Syria. We used to have lengthy discussions about these things. Before I answer the questions about the Arab uprising, let me just, since we are talking about Arab perceptions of the United States, and let's be blunt from the beginning. There is a rising anti-Americanism in the region. And I thought I'll just put it in context and read you some excerpts from an official American memo on this issue. Actually, the title is Anti-Americanism in the Arab World. Anti-Americanism is resurgent in the Arab world. And then it talks about vitriolic public statements, fantastic rumors, Muslim extremists, and then it tries to come up with some ways of dealing with this. Our best efforts must be directed towards stemming this tide of anti-Americanism. Then it talks about how to confront journalists and visit them and correct them and debunk their unbased vitriolic attacks on the United States. The interesting thing is, this memo is dated May 1st, 1950. May 1st, 1950. 1 month after I was born. Now, you know how old I am. And it's signed by Secretary of State Dean Acheson. 1950. We've been there. We've been there. The issue is, I would love to go back there, because this is anti-Americanism light. Today, anti-Americanism is toxic. Is toxic. And it is an integral part of the political culture. And it is extremely difficult to deal with. And it is all over the place, particularly in the Arab East. It is less so. It is less pronounced. It's less ugly in the Maghreb. It is toxic in the Arab East. What is more shocking, it is toxic in places that the Americans consider friendly states, i.e. mainly Egypt. And we can talk about that. So, but let me answer the question now. I was obviously ecstatic with the rebellions in, I never called them the Arab Spring. I hated that moniker. It didn't make any sense. And instantly, the Arabs themselves never called it the Arab Spring. There isn't a single documented article written by an Arab commentator or a columnist, correct me if I'm wrong, who said this is an Arab Spring. It was taken from the Prague Spring in 1968, which was also taken from the, those of you who remember European history, 1848 revolutions that swept Europe at that time that Karl Marx famously wrote about. Now I'm going back to my old leftist days.
Also your current leftist.
Well, you know. So I was ecstatic, obviously, about Tunisia and about Egypt. And if you remember the amazing unfolding of events, in few days, one despot was kicked out of Tunis, and another one from his palace in Cairo. And I kept remembering, again, going back to my leftist days, Ryan, what Vladimir Lenin once said. He said, you know, the wily Russian was awful in many ways, but he was also a smart student of history. He said, sometimes decades pass and nothing happens, and sometimes weeks pass and sometimes in weeks decades happen. And that's what we've seen at that time. But I always felt that the forces of the old order were so entrenched. The fact that these groups are mainly students who are not very well organized, were not driven by one clear-cut ideology. There was no clear-cut, quote-unquote, revolutionary agent, and there was no charismatic leader. I mean, these are the classic revolutions. You have a charismatic leader, you have an ideology, and then you have a revolutionary agent. None of this existed in those societies. And that's why the old order resurrected itself and reasserted itself. But what was fascinating to me is that this is the first time I see literally millions of Arabs in the street, and nobody burned an American flag, since we're talking about the United States and the Arabs. Nobody burned an American flag. This was not about Zionism. This was not about imperialism. This is not about our own obsession with what the West did to us and the colonial legacy and all of that. None of it existed in the first few weeks in Tunisia, and none of it existed in the first few weeks and months, actually, in Egypt, and not even, oh, I'm falling apart here, and not even, don't worry about it, and not even in other places like in Libya, and definitely not in Syria. So that was very, very reassuring. Again, the uprisings were not driven by what we call a meta-ideology. There was nothing really broad other than we want karama, we want dignity, we want empowerment, we want to have a say in how to govern ourselves. And this was obviously great. I happen to agree with the way the president handled the first few weeks of these uprisings, whether in Tunis or in Egypt. I had problems later on with the way we handled Syria, or the way we are still handling Syria, but that's another issue. I was also extremely pleased with the way the American media covered the Arab uprisings. I was somewhat pleased, not fully, with the way the Arab media covered the Arab uprisings. And there was a great deal of support for these revolutions. But then later on, unfortunately, we hit a brick wall, the wall of the old order, economic degradation, the fact that these movements were not organized, and most importantly, the fact that the only organized groups, the Islamists, began to reassert themselves, and essentially they hijacked a process that was begun by other groups. And now we see them as the most effective forces, whether we're talking about Tunisia, a country with tremendous tradition of secularism and modernity, in Egypt, in Syria, unfortunately, in Libya, also in Yemen. And now there is a great deal of confusion, there is a great deal of anger, and when we talk about Arab anti-Americanism in the Arab world, all you have to do is just look at Egypt. It is, I've never seen it as bad as in the last year, and interestingly enough, Arab states are still incredibly influential in giving hints or in influencing the way the Arab media sees, or most of the Arab media, or some of the Arab media, let's be honest, how they see the United States. And I think many journalists in Egypt take their cue from the government, and hence you see this hostile coverage of the United States. The American ambassador was hounded out of Cairo, It was offensive. It was insulting to anybody's intelligence to read the Egyptian newspapers about the activities of Ann Patterson. You would think that Ann Patterson was leading the counter-revolution against the new government in Egypt, or against the new they don't call it a coup. This is the non-coup coup, you know. And I've never seen anything similar to what happened to Robert Ford. I know Robert Ford just as Ryan, everybody else knows Robert Ford. The man was subjected to a character assassination in the Egyptian media, and the government of the United States knuckled under pressure and withdrew his nomination. There was no agrément. His name was not even sent to Cairo officially. And yet the Egyptian media massacred this man's reputation, destroyed his reputation, and essentially we said fine because we withdrew his nomination. So that gives you an idea about the difficulty that we are dealing, all of us, when it comes to the kind of media in the Arab world that still follows essentially the lead of the government.
Well, you have both set the stage for my next question. Hisham, you've certainly defined the problem. Abderrahim has talked a bit about how you and Al-Jazeera seek to portray the reality of the U.S. Given this toxic environment, as Hisham puts it, sometimes generated by governments, you know, what advice would you have for us in attempting to convey to Arab audiences what our policies are, why they are, who we are, what our principles are, in a way that will kind of break through that screen or even wall of prejudice and misinformation. I was struck by Hisham's point, which I hadn't really reflected on. There haven't been any American flags burned, as toxic as the atmosphere may be. So it isn't all bad. At least our flag budget hasn't gone up. So if you'd care to take that on, just you know, what can we do as a government and indeed as a people to ensure that our ties with a very important region, and this is not just governments, but peoples, to get to a better place than where we are. And the final thing I'll say, or I'm doing more talking than our panelists, you know, it's worth bearing in mind that we were a very late comer to the Middle East stage as a political actor post-World War II. Prior to that, we were there, but we were there in a philanthropic role. The American University of Beirut, the American University of Cairo, clinics and hospitals in different places in the region that are still remembered. We see ourselves as the anti-imperialists. Hey, we had our own revolution. You know, so how can we convey some of that in a way that might really get through?
Well, let me first of all start with the history, since you ended with the history. And the history is, as you rightly pointed out, the United States, on the surface of it, as far as perceptions in the Middle East are concerned, on the surface of it, is a newcomer to the region, dating back to the post-Second World War era. But if you dig deeper, both in American presence and in Arab perception of it, it actually goes much earlier than that. The perception in the Middle East is that before the United States got involved tooth and nail in the region, the French were there, the Brits were there, the Europeans were there. And at some point, a connection is made between Europe and the United States. Doesn't always work in the favor of the United States, that connection, which is that the United States is an extension of European presence in that part of the world. And when you say European presence in that part of the world, there's a nefarious part of that perception. European presence is not associated always with science, with progress, with human rights. It's associated with the antithesis of that. It's associated with oppression, with colonialism. It's associated with, heck, in some parts of the Middle East, with the Crusades going back several hundred years. I think, again, when it comes to the history, part of the story that people do not know in the Arab world and here in the United States are the good things that the Americans stood for in that part of the world at a crucial part of the region's history. When, for example, Hisham mentioned the Middle East and North Africa, when peoples across the region were fighting for independence, many people seem to not know the role that the United States played in supporting the aspirations of the peoples of the Middle East and North Africa fighting for the independence of their countries throughout the 50s and the early 60s.
Algeria in particular.
Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, and the list goes on. And the Americans may have done it for their own reasons, to poke the British in the eyes or to secure their own interests. But the fact of the situation is that they did it. They did support those independence movements across the region. And I think, you know, to stop beating about the bush, where the United States runs into serious problems in the Middle East, and you live there and you know this, is when it comes to the Arab-Israeli conflict. The perception has built up over decades that the United States supports the Israelis no matter what they do against the Palestinians. That's the perception. What has the United States done to counter that perception? Even to me, that remains, you know, open for debate. I think you can do all the PR you like. You can do all the work of, you know, the Al-Hurra or Voice of America or Al-Jazeera or Al-Arabiya, at the end of the day, you scale down to the core issue, which is the policy. And I don't know to what extent the State Department or other agencies reaching out to people in the Middle East trying to change that perception. I don't know to what extent just reaching out is able to help bridge that gap and change that perception. But look, 3 years ago, the region went into a different situation. And if you compare now, here's the irony of the situation. If you compare now the carnage that's going on in places such as Syria and Libya and Egypt, and just numerically, you count how many Arabs have been killed in these events, and you go back in history and you count how many Arabs have been killed in conflicts with Israel, I think it's a very complex and complicated picture emerges from there, not just with regard to the Israelis, but with regard to U.S. foreign policy in that part of the world. The Arab-Israeli conflict I think, has receded now. For now, I'm not sure to what extent it will continue to be in the position where it is now. Syria, Egypt, Libya, and others have, as of 3 years ago, moved on to the forefront. My sense is that if the dust ever settles, and there have been studies about this, Arabs and Muslims in general will continue, in large part, to look at the United States and its role in terms of what it's doing within the Arab-Israeli realm. That's my sense. If I may just quickly add one more thing, since we're talking about broadcasting here. Broadcasting has a, I mean, I'm stating the obvious here. Broadcasting has a very, 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 very important role to play. Whether in terms of getting to Americans what goes on in that part of the world, or explaining to Arabs what goes on here in the United States and how Americans feel about that part of the world. As a broad principle, I have always felt that, let's take Al-Hurra, for example. Since we're all among friends here, we're not going to beat about the bush. Al-Hurra, when it first came into being, a lot of people raised questions about it. To what extent will it connect with Arabs as opposed to Al-Jazeera, which was going really, really strong at that time? Now there's a lot of controversy about Al-Jazeera. Its role has become much more controversial. But at that time, there were a lot of questions raised about Al-Hurra, what it means for the United States, what it means for the effort to reach out to Arabs. And it was seen by a lot of people in a negative light. My feeling at that time, and it continues to be the same today, was that I worked for BBC for over a decade. I know, and no offense meant here, but since we're invited to speak our minds, I will say it. The BBC was created as a propaganda tool to counter Hitler's propaganda. And yet, the BBC over the last few decades has been transformed into a genuine medium for disseminating credible, accurate news that not only give people credible and accurate news, but also reflects very positively on Britain and the British government. The fact that, for example, you get a lot of criticism of the British government on the BBC is seen as a good thing in the Middle East. And I think there's a lesson in that for all of us, whether it's Al-Hurra or Al-Jazeera or Al-Arabiya, or when you are seen as trying to have a genuine conversation, not just about what goes on in the Middle East, but about yourself and your role in what goes on in the Middle East, I think you will be getting somewhere. That's my view.
Thank you, Hisham. What do you think we might do to change perceptions and images?
You were, you were absolutely correct when you talked about the history. I mean, there are many reasons why once upon a time there was a great deal of reservoir of goodwill towards the United States, in the Arab East at least. And there were many reasons. You mentioned the American University in Beirut, it was established in 1864, then later on the American University in Cairo. And then I remember as a little kid reading the wonderful accounts of life in America written by Lebanese immigrants, you know, Gibran and Amin Rihani and all of these people. After the First World War, when the King Crane mission went to the Middle East, people were asked, you know, who would like to be your mandate, you know, colonial power or whatever. They said, you want to be independent, but if there is going to be a colonial power, let it be the United States. Not France, and not Britain. But what worked well for the United States is that the United States did not have a colonial legacy in the Middle East. The United States did not rule over Arabs and Muslims, unlike the Brits, the Italians, the Spaniards, and the French. This was extremely important. So there was this huge reservoir of goodwill towards the United States. It began to change in the late 1950s, and the watershed was 1967, and the American support for Israel after that. In fact, in 1956, Eisenhower briefly was a hero because he stood up to the so-called tripartite aggression against Egypt and asked the British and the French and the Israelis to withdraw from the canal cities and from the Sinai. In the 1960s, John F. Kennedy became a hero in Algeria because he supported the struggle of the Algerian people for independence from our friends, the French. But 67 was the watershed in terms of the Arab-Israeli thing. The other thing later on, one reason why the United States was seen in a negative light by liberal forces, progressive forces, or whatnot, was the American support for autocratic Arab regimes. This is extremely important. This is extremely important. The United States trained these people who used to torture Arab political prisoners in jail. The United States supported all of these regimes, actually Arab and Muslim regimes, from the Hindu Kush to Morocco. George Bush, in his second inaugural speech, go back and read it. It's an extremely important political document. He said something no American president said before. He said, we, the Americans, for the past 60 years, looked the other way when our friends in the Arab and the Muslim world were doing the unspeakable to their own people. And we did that in the name of free flow of oil, alliances against the Soviet Union, and stability. We ended up with no stability and a place that created Osama bin Laden and all the beasts who came and visited us on 9/11. Later on also, the war in Iraq, what followed the war in Iraq also deepened the sense of alienation between the Arabs and the Americans. At the same time, there were certain political forces in the Arab world, and let's be blunt about this. They are now, I would call them professional anti-American. And you find them on Arab television, and you find them in many newspapers. These are the old remnants of the Arab nationalists and the Islamists. There is an alliance. These two hate each other for a variety of reasons, but they agree on a couple of things. One of them, this anti-Americanism stand, whatever, anti-Zionism. And sometimes, let's be blunt about it, anti-Semitism. And you find these people, and I find them today on Egyptian television, railing against the United States. One of my critique of Al-Jazeera, and I hope my friend will accept that, is that they provided a podium for these forces. I remember when Al-Arabiya was being established, I was invited to help as a contractor. I used to do a show for them. I was not an employee. And I was pleasantly surprised that when we had the meeting, somebody said, are we going to have a religion, an hour or two devoted to religion? And all of us said, hell no. And yet you found somebody like Al-Qaradawi, who was given a platform on Al Jazeera to rail and spew his poison against modernity, against women, against the West, against everything I stand for as a secularist. These are the people that you have to deal with. So there are people who are professionally inclined to be anti-Americanism because that's good business. You never go wrong if you dump it on the Americans and the Israelis and the Zionists and the Freemasons, you name it. There has to be a conspiracy of some sort. And sometimes American officials don't know how to deal with this. I have no problem reminding the Egyptians that the United States saved the Third Army in 1973. I don't reminding the Egyptians that 56, it was Eisenhower who helped them. Or at Camp David. Whether the United States did it for its own purposes as a great power, a superpower, or an imperial power, I don't care, and it's immaterial. Let me say something. I mean, something the Americans also don't do when it comes to the Muslim world in general. In the 1990s, we've seen for the first time since the Holocaust on European soil, people in Bosnia and Kosovo were being killed because of their ethnic and religious backgrounds, and they were being killed en masse. And what did the great European powers do? Especially the Germans or the French or the Russians were helping the Serbs. Nothing. Until the Clinton administration was dragged into the war and was forced to use NATO and stop the killing of Muslims. And we don't remind the Muslim world of this. I'm a big supporter of the Kurds, the right of the Kurds for self-determination. It was the United States that helped them when they were being mowed down by Saddam in 1991. When the first tsunami happened, it was not 206, I guess, or 204, I can't remember exactly. It happened in an area where the damage was close to China and India, and these are powerful countries. They are not weak, small countries or poor countries. And yet the Marines were there for the first time to dole out the clean water and the tents and the medicine and whatnot. I mean, sometimes we fail to remind the world of what the United States did. Of course, the United States made stupid mistakes, of course, and the unqualified support for Israel has been damaging forever. But many people don't know the United States society, the American society. One of my critique of my own friends and myself sometimes is we cover Washington, we don't cover a continent called the United States. I'm proud to say I'm probably the only Arab journalist who writes about the American Civil War. I'm the only Arab journalist who writes about the blues. You know, I try to write about America, a country that I've lived here most of my life. And I come from a leftist background, as Ryan knows. When I came here, my hair was on my shoulder, and I used to think that Che Guevara is the new Jesus Christ. Then I discovered Jefferson and Lincoln. And when people tell me why, it's serious. We don't remind people of this. And this is it's your job as broadcasters here. When somebody asks me why do you become an American citizen, I always say because of what I would call my secular Bible. The Bill of Rights, the Constitution, the Federalist Papers, and I worship Lincoln, but I live in Virginia. I call myself Virginian because of Jefferson and company. And I'm a Civil War history buff. We Arabs don't know America. When I tell Arabs that the Americans are religious people, they are surprised. They think of us as Osama bin Laden and as Sayyid Qutb thinks. By the way, next time, if you want to go back and read or listen to the rantings of Osama bin Laden, you will hear echoes of Sayyid Qutb. Sayyid Qutb is one of the luminaries of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. This little man, and he was little in many ways, physically too, very conservative, came to the United States and spent 2 years at the late 1980s. This was the era when the United States won the Second World War. This is the era of big bands, jazz and music and women liberation, and he was shocked to his core. And he felt that this country is hedonistic and decadent. And we know that because he used to write letters to his buddies in Egypt. And he at one time would say, if there is a conflict between us and the West and Christianity, we will win because we are disciplined, and these people are decadent. That view of America is still there. You find it among the Islamists, but other groups too. But when you tell Arabs the spirit of volunteerism in America, they don't know anything about it. Arabs think the Americans don't care about anything else. They're materialists, they are behind money, chasing money, and they have no care about other people. There is no when you tell them about civic responsibility. Arabs are great, by the way, when it comes to taking care of their own families. We all take care of our families, even extended families. We give money, we help, we go out of our way. But we don't have a civic responsibility. But when you tell Arabs about American civic responsibility, they are surprised. They don't know. And one of my critique of Al-Hurra, and I remember receiving people from, I was asked to brief people on the Hill before Al-Hurra, before even the name came up. And Joe Biden was one of the biggest enthusiasts for Al-Hurra, or for the broadcast, whatever. And I said to them, if you want to do something like that, cover the United States. Don't cover the Arab world. An Egyptian is going to listen to an Egyptian television telling you, or telling him, or telling her what happened in Taba, or what happened in Sinai, or what happened in Libya, or what happened in Lebanon. But they don't know the United States. They don't know what lies behind the Beltway. And still people in the Arab world don't know much but what lies behind the Beltway. And the other thing we have to keep in mind is that even Arab journalists who come here, and by the way, let me say this and be fair, Arab journalism today is much, much better than it used to be 15 years ago. It is more nuanced, it is more secularist. And I mean, not more, I wish it is. More nuanced and more sophisticated. I wish it would be more secularist. Just on the other hand, American journalism has improved markedly in the last 10, 15 years. When I was a young man, I used to read stuff in the American newspapers. I remember when when Muhammad Ali Aja took a shot at Pope John Paul, Joseph Kraft, the famous columnist in those days, called it the dark side of Islam. Used to read all sorts of stories about the Green Menace and all of these things. Now we don't see this. Now American journalism sees the Muslim world not as a bunch of undifferentiated people, but they see the nuances, they see the complexities, and they cover it. So the Arab media also improved in the last few years. But essentially, those of us who cover Washington, unlike those who are covering Washington for Greek television or Turkish or Japanese television or Australian television, we cover a country that is omniscient and omnipresent in our minds in the Middle East. A Greek journalist doesn't feel that weight. And that's why sometimes the coverage is influenced by that weight, that tradition, that legacy that the United States has. But I think essentially if we tell people about the complexity of this, I mean, I always find it fun to talk about a success story of an Arab American or a Lebanese American, because most of them are Lebanese, forgive me, who made it big in this country. In every field. In every field. When you hear Charles Ashi, the director of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in California, he's Lebanese, he was born in Lebanon, he speaks with a thick accent 10 times worse than mine. And does anybody care that his name is Charles Ashi and he was born in Beirut? We all read Fareed Zakaria. Fareed Zakaria comes from a Muslim family. He was born in Mumbai. He came here as a 4-year-old boy. His son's name is Omar, like mine. When he writes something at do you think at the White House they say, well, this is Fareed Zakaria, but this is different than Tom Friedman or David Ignatius? No. Most Arabs don't know this. They don't know this side of America. So we can have differences over policy, and my friend Abderrahim is correct. There will always be differences over policy. I always tell my friends and my, anybody who's willing to, there is a huge difference between being critical of the United States, and I am many times critical of the United States. It just happened that I love it, but I'm critical of it because I do care. And there's a huge difference between being critical and being hostile. And I think we should take on those guys who are being hostile on purpose in the Arab world and call them up and point out to these positive aspects in American society. I had a fight with Karen Hughes at one time when she said, or even when Colin Powell, and I had a wonderful relationship with him, used to call it, it's an American brand. I said, America is not a brand. You're not selling Uncle Tom rice. It's not a brand. It's a culture. It's values. And let the people know what's happening here. I, as a little kid, first time in my life, not a kid, I was a teenager, first time I saw Citizen Kane. I saw Citizen Kane in a program for American movies sponsored by the American University in downtown Beirut. First jazz ensemble I've seen was in Beirut, sponsored by an American embassy. Now American embassies are forts. The only thing lacking is the moat.
We're working on it.
And I think, I know, and Ryan could tell you what happened to him and his wife in Damascus. So I understand the difficulty of American diplomats and people who work in the U.S. in cultural activities to go out and introduce America to them. But you have to do it. I mean, this is one way of doing it. And if it's up to me, if I'm working here at Al-Hurra, I will drive you nuts to give us, resources to go and cover America with all its complexities.
Hisham, I think that's a great point on which to turn this over to the audience. We all have a lot more to say, but I think we'll say it in response to questions from our governors and others in the room. Just let me thank you both for some very thought-provoking comments and points of view. So with that, we turn it over to the floor.
I guess I'll start. I got a bunch. So first of all, thank you both for being here, and Ryan, thanks for moderating this. It struck me we're talking about we here at Al-Hurra and Sawa broadcast to the Arab world, but whenever I read about the Arab world, there's obviously lots of complexities within the Arab world, and even the Shiite-Sunni conflict. First of all, I guess two-part question. One, can you broadcast? Is there such thing as a pan-Arabic world? I mean, I know there's a shared language, but does that make it a shared culture? Can you actually broadcast to the Arab world as a monolithic group? And then number two, how important is the Shiite and Sunni perspective as far as Arabs' view towards America? Is there a difference if you're a Shiite in your view towards America or a Sunni in your view toward America, or is that not really a defining factor? So I guess that's my question.
On the first point, obviously, if you travel from the Atlantic, Morocco, which is the country I'm from, to the Gulf, as you rightly pointed out, there are certain commonalities, and they're very important and crucial commonalities. Language is one of them. But there are obviously different sensibilities. Each country has its own sensibility. Each sub-region has its own sensibility. I'm thinking of Al-Jazeera as a case in point. We have a show, a daily news show, that targets the countries of the Maghreb, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, and Mauritania. And the question has always been, well, why does that hour have to come after the main newsreel, which is called Al-Hasad, or the day's harvest? If we're all Arabs, then we should all be expected to watch each other's news and find out about what's happening in each other's countries. And the argument is that the Middle East proper, especially the Levant part of it, it just seems to lurch from one crisis to another. So it seems to be a much more important focus for news than the rest of the region. But the rest of the region would like to feel that it is also on the radar. So, that goes to the point that, yes, you can broadcast to the Arab world, and you can be pan-Arab in your broadcasting. But the days when you could only focus on one country exclusively, or one sub-region exclusively, they're clearly gone. I mean, no one would have expected Tunisia, such a small country, to unleash the events that we are currently witnessing and which are transforming the entire region from the Atlantic to the Gulf. So I think you can ignore that and just pretend that this is just a pan-Arab region and we should just it has only one important topic. Up until 3 years ago, the assumption on Al-Jazeera, Al-Arabiya, and some of the main ones was Israel-Palestine. Now that's changed. Now, which one do you focus on? Do you focus on Egypt, Syria, Libya, Tunisia? Which one do you focus? That's become a real challenge for us in terms of setting the agenda. And even in terms of the language, there are issues. Because the further away you travel from the Levant heading towards the Atlantic, the more the issue of language becomes an issue. As you move away from the standard towards the local languages of North Africa, that becomes a problem. If you broadcast something about Algeria or Morocco with Algerians and Moroccans speaking in their own dialect, what do? Do you voice them over? That's an affront to the whole Pan-Arab ideal. Do you have them as subtitles? That's an affront to the Pan-Arab ideal. Do you leave them as they are? Many people in the Middle East would not understand. But there is a common standard language which enables us to broadcast the Pan-Arab way.
The Shami language.
Well,
my
the
prejudice.
Haytham language. The issue of the Sunnis and the Shia. Look, I mean, quite frankly, my reading of it is that it doesn't matter whether it's Shia or Sunni. At the end of the day, it's the power play. The Sunnis, you know, this whole sectarian divide now, in many of its important aspects, it's a fight about power. It's not about Shia or Sunni. So it depends on the power relationship that they have with the United States. And I just to skip out of that for a little while and circle back to something that Hisham said.
I know
a little while ago. And I think it's very important that we stay nuanced about what prism we use to look at Islamists throughout the Middle East and North Africa. And again, I want to anchor this in what I've just said about power. I think that if the Muslim Brotherhood continued to rule in Egypt, I think the pragmatism that comes with power on both sides, the United States side and that side, I think you would have seen a different dynamic and you would have seen a different perception. I agree that there are parts of the Islamist spectrum that will never look positively on the United States. In the same way that there are parts of the American spectrum who will never look positively on anything Arab or Muslim. That's just the way it is. But I think if the power relationship had changed and Islamists did the right thing in governing Egypt or Tunisia, or I think you would be seeing a different dynamic. Just one more quick thought. I think that when events were going on in Tahrir Square 3 years ago, my feeling was that the United States and others should bet on young people. They shouldn't bet on the military. They shouldn't bet on the Muslim Brotherhood, because everybody compromised themselves in the final outcome. The military did, the Muslim Brotherhood did, and the youth were marginalized. But I suppose that's a lesson that they will study and learn from. But I think to say that, you know, the Islamists are all anti-American, I don't think that's accurate. The other thing is to say that, you know, we have to be like Al-Arabiya, we have to be like Al-Jazeera. You know, you can't be like anything. It's like if you're Al-Hurra, you're Al-Hurra, and you have your own style and you have your own agenda. You just have to find the things that you think will give you viewership in that part of the world. And the Middle East has become, in terms of the media market, it has become a very tough market even for us, Al-Jazeera, to compete in. Over the last 3 years. There was a time when we reigned supreme. Those days are gone. The media scene has changed in Tunisia, in Libya, in Egypt, and so forth. And what's
Not to mention
happening...
the social media.
What's that?
Not to mention the
Not
social
to mention
media.
social media. And I think what's happening, what happened in Egypt, and just to allow me one more time to retort to something that Hisham said. Al-Jazeera is an imperfect medium in an imperfect world. You can talk about Al-Qaradawi, you can talk about giving a platform to people who are anti-American, that's fine. That's fine. You can level those criticisms at Al Jazeera. But you also have to give Al Jazeera credit for some of the good things that have happened. And one of those good things that have happened is that it has shown people in the region that there is another argument to be made, that there is an advantage in dissent, that, you know, what dictators in the Arab world say is not the only narrative, that there is another argument, and that there is something called the American argument. By inviting Americans on Al Jazeera, whether they are from the government or from think tanks, or to express an American point of view by covering American elections. I just want to leave you with this thought. I have, over the years, been very critical of the number of hours that Al Jazeera Arabic, has devoted to the coverage of American elections. And I felt that at times Al Jazeera covered US elections, gave them more time than the American networks did. But if you look at it cumulatively, I think it was a good thing because it gave Arabs an idea about what happens when you become unhappy with a president. You go to the polling station, you kick out that president. And we've done that. I've been with Al Jazeera since 2002. I have covered countless elections. And the good thing, it's a good opportunity to express to Arabs not just how Americans can go to the polls and kick a president out, but actually the mechanics of the American political system, of American political culture, that there's something called compromise. At the end of the day, if there hadn't been a sense of compromise, the United States may have gone to war in Florida in 2000. That didn't happen. It's happening now in the Arab world. People are picking up arms to settle political divides. It doesn't happen here. That is one of the things that, one of the messages that we have tried to convey time and time again to our viewers across the Arab region.
So if we can get I could ask, these are not easy issues, and it's hard to be compressed, but I ask you to be as compressed as possible.
Can I do that again?
We've got 27 minutes left. It's Matt.
So thank you very, very much for your comments, your observations, and your recommendations. They're very enlightening and very powerful. So thank you very much. On Saeed Qutb, I think it's important to note, for those that aren't aware of him, that I would suspect that an American from a big city that had been put into the same situation that Qutb was may have had the same reaction, just because it was a unique situation. But my question is, how would you reflect back on your coverage of the Arab uprisings, and what would you change?
Why don't you both take a brief shot at that? That's because you came at it from two slightly different angles.
What would I change, or my? I would be more critical, especially in the early phase, of those forces who are not organized, who did not tell us exactly what is their agenda, their political agenda. I would have been more. I was very critical, but I would wish that my network and the media in general would have been more critical. In the case of Egypt, with SCAF, with the military, the first time when they threw out Mubarak, because their rule was characterized by oppression and violation of human rights, killing people in the streets, something, by the way, the Egyptian army never did until last year. Unlike the Syrian army, the great Syrian army, or the great Iraqi army, or the great Algerian army, or the Yemeni army, all of them shot at people in the streets. Tunisian army, which is very small, luckily, thank God for Tunisia, didn't do that. I would have been more critical of the Islamists, but actually I cannot be more critical of the Islamists because I'm too critical of the Islamists. But I would have liked to see more criticism of the Ikhwan. I was opposed to the coup. I called it a coup. My network doesn't like to call it a coup. I call it a coup. I write in the English website, and I call it a coup. Those of you who have time to kill, you can read my stuff. I've never liked Arab militaries because their job was never to defend the homeland, but just to help the ruling powers crush the people. And they've always did the lousy job defending the homeland and did a worse job in killing their own people. So I don't look favorably at any coup. I've always had a jaundiced view of the Islamists. I'm a secularist. I don't like people to drag religion into politics. I'm not naive. They do it in Europe. We do it in this country. But at least we have a great constitution. And we know what the separation between state and church, although a lot of people, some people in this country would like to blur that distinction. I want that distinction to be made. There are many Arabs and Muslims who claim, erroneously in my opinion, that Islam is deen wa dawla, religion and state. That may be theoretically, but the great periods of Islam, the people who were in charge of the political domain were in charge, period. When Salah ad-Din was the ruler, he was the political leader, not the mufti. I don't know who's the religious leader at that time. I don't know who's the religious leader when Muawiyah was in charge in Damascus. I don't know the religious leader when Abderrahim al-Dakhil, the great one in Cordoba, was in Spain. It was the political leadership that was in charge. And the Muslim world should remind themselves that unless they make that distinction, the politics in the Muslim world will always be skewed. And yes, I do have a problem with political Islam. Because political Islam has a problem with non-Muslims in their own societies. Worse, political Islam has a problem with women. Political Islam has a problem with gender equality. And unless they deal with that issue. You asked about this, the gentleman next to you asked about the Arab world. We don't call it the Arab world for nothing. By the way, we have something in common, the Americans and the Arabs. The beautiful thing about the Arabs is that you cannot reduce them to a religion, and you cannot reduce them to a race. You can be as black as the night and be an Arab. You can be a descendant from the Crusades, because I suspect that my grandfather, who used to look like an Irishman, was a descendant of the Crusades. You can be dark-skinned. You can be tall. You can have blue eyes and green eyes and fair hair and black hair, and you can be an Arab. Just as in the United States, you can be as white and an American, as black as an American, and Latino, and whatever. That's the beauty of the United States. That's what I love about this country. But that's also the great thing about the Arab world. In the Arab world, it's true Arabic is the dominant language. It's true that Islam is the dominant language, but that's it, full stop, period. There are great non-Arab minorities. The Amazigh, the Berber, the Kurds, the Turkoman, who live among us. You have 12 million Christians in Egypt, at least. We had more than 1 million Christians in Baghdad. Unfortunately, since the 2003 invasion of Iraq, 50% of the Christians of Iraq left Iraq. And now we see a campaign against the Christians in Syria. And we see a regime in Syria diabolically using, sectarianism. So we have to be nuanced about the Arab world. In Algeria, the whole issue today, until this moment, is an issue of identity. Are we Arabs? Are we Berber? Are we Mediterranean? Are we African? Are we Muslim? What the hell are we? These are nuanced issues that those people themselves, not you, and I used to fume when George Bush would talk about Islam, that this is a religion of this. It's not your business. You don't know anything about it. We are still struggling with how to define political Islam, for instance, in modern times. So one has to be nuanced about the whole Arab world. But Lebanon is not Yemen. Yemen is not Tunisia. Egypt has certain traditions that Sudan doesn't have, or Algeria doesn't have. So you have to be a little bit nuanced about this. But when it comes to how to deal with the current situation, I think the United States should support people who echo values that are similar to the Americans. I always criticize Americans because I said, don't go overseas and fish for Jeffersonian Democrats. There aren't too many of them, okay? And our democracy is different than European democracy, than Japanese democracy or Indian democracy. But there are basic things, those who respect basic human rights. Pluralism is the most important thing. My problem with those youth who went to the Egyptian street, secularists, those people who belong to the so-called tamarrud, these, naive kids, they are illiberal. They were justifying shooting Islamists in the street just because they are Islamists. I don't like the Islamists, but I don't like anybody to be shot in the streets. We should stand up for people who have a sense of liberalism, who accept the other, and accept that there are political differences, and try to educate people about what we call political coalitions. In the minds of many Arabs, including those so-called secularists who marching in the streets against Mubarak and against Ben Ali. Zero-sum game, politics. And we should call anybody, whether they are Islamists or supporters of the military, if they are going to deny people political rights, or if they're going to deny women their basic human civil rights, or they're going to hound the minorities, we should call them all the time. We should stand up and call them. The United States did not do that when Morsi was doing his stupid things, and we are not doing it enough with the current crop in Cairo. We should do it everywhere. And even our friends like Maliki, who owes his job for the Americans, by the way, they don't reflect the values that we have. And I think this should be the standard, if there should be a standard.
Abderrahim, if I could just take us back to Matt's question, what would you have done differently in the early coverage of the Arab uprisings?
I'll be very brief. I agree with everything that Now, I do with many of the things that he said. I have one or two reservations. I'll be very brief. And they are rooted in the background, our background, which is that we live here in the United States. And, you know, it's a good thing, but it's also a hazard. Because the environment where we live tends to color the way we see the world. So when these things started in the Middle East, we all thought that, you know, it was going to be positive, it was going to be quick, and it was going to lead to something very different from what it turned out to be. I mentioned earlier that I thought that, you know, we should have supported the youth in Egypt. And, you know, 3 years later, I realized that given the power play in Egypt, that would have been a totally naive thing to do. That's what it is, because the people who had the power, the military and the Muslim Brotherhood, they fought it out. I think that one of the things that, I don't know if I should call it a mistake or a miscalculation, was the extent to which the so-called Arab Spring spread from Tunisia, and I'm talking about Al-Jazeera here, we continue to face this criticism that we were very eclectic in our coverage, in our focus. We focused on Egypt, we focused a lot on Libya, we barely focused on Bahrain, we focused on Syria in a different way. And I think it's very difficult when you find yourself in the middle of it to do the right thing, and therefore hindsight is always 20/20. But I think we should have seen it coming, and we should have seen the criticism coming that if we did it in one country in one way and we did it differently in another country, then we would be criticized of being eclectic. But hey, I am saying this in the country of a president who has been criticized for doing the same thing, for saying, now each Arab country has its own specificities, and I will deal with each country separately. So, as I said, in hindsight, it's easier to come to that kind of criticism. Finally, the one thing that I feel very uncomfortable with as a journalist was the extent to which I thought 3 years ago that it would be legitimate to call what's happening in the Middle East revolutions. I think we should have been a little bit more restrained in the qualification, because a revolution to me is not just about changing a political system, even if you could change a political system, and we know in Egypt that never happened. A revolution is changing a lot of other things. I mean, if you see what's happening now in southern Libya with the taboo, and the way a revolution should have led us to look at each other in the Arab world as citizens, in the case of Libya, regarding whether Arab or we're black. And that kind of transformation has not happened yet. So terminology is very important. I think that in hindsight, we should have been a little more restrained in using the terminology that we're using.
Very good point. Yep.
Hi, my name is I'm Carlos Garcia. I'm the director of Radio and TV Marti. This is way out of my boundary, but this has been a great panel. I'm learning a lot, so I have a question. If you take, being a broadcaster, if you take, let's not think about the political boundaries within the region. Are there communities that go for pluralism, human rights, that go beyond the political boundaries, that we can target as broadcasters to change all the things that you said that U.S. has done wrong through all these years?
You know, if I may, Hisham, I think that such constituencies do exist, but they've had two main problems. One is that they were ill-prepared for the post-so-called revolutions, and the other thing is that they've been drowned out by the bigger elephants around them. We mentioned there are, you know, the youth, there are the NGOs, there are a lot of constituencies that would be very interested in this kind of thought that you're talking about. Incidentally, I do think that the Arab region has moved beyond the point where the United States could sit back and say, how can we influence events with this country? I think now the United States is at a point where it has to sit back and say, how can I move things with a particular constituency within a particular country, whether the Islamists or the military or the NGOs, to create the kind of environment where it becomes possible for the U.S. to secure its own interests, as to encouraging people in the Arab world, Arabs themselves, to change in this or that particular direction. I'm not sure that is, you know, I'm not sure to what extent that is feasible for the Americans at this particular point in time.
Can I take a crack at it? The problem that we face in the Arab world today, and as people and as, you know, as journalists, is that we are dealing with a world that was literally and physically pulverized by 60 years of coercive, repressive, autocratic, dictatorial regimes. You look at Saddam Hussein and you are reminded of Pol Pot. You look what Assad is doing to his own people and you shiver. I mean, we're not talking about, you know, your run-of-the-mill autocrat. We're talking about people who are willing to burn their societies, to create a scorched earth, desolation. And that's what they have done. They killed political life. Between the two world wars, Ryan will tell you about Iraq because he studied Iraq. Anybody here knows anything about Egypt? I love the old Egypt. Iraq, between the two world wars, and Egypt between the two world wars, we refer that as the liberal era. There was a semblance of political life. There were political parties. They were not like us here. There were unions. There were women who were participating in the workforce. Minorities were not as oppressed as they are. How many people here know that at the turn of the 20th century, the Jewish population of Baghdad was 20%? Not 5%, 7%, 10%, 20%. They were extremely active in the life of those societies. So what happened with the military rules and with the Arab nationalists and with the one-man rule and one-party rule is that they pulverized these societies physically, literally, politically, socially. There is no vibrant civil society. I can give you a picture. And people were more tolerant. Only one book of Najib Mahfouz was banned for a period of time in Egypt. In 1926, a man named Ali Abderrahim wrote a book called Al-Islam wa Usul al-Hukm about the state and Muslim societies. He was not hounded, he was not killed. Under Mubarak, intellectuals were shot at and killed. One intellectual was accused by the Islamists of apostasy, and he was hounded out of Egypt and ended up seeking asylum in Copenhagen. This is the modern day Egypt that could not protect one intellectual from the terror of these groups. So now you are dealing with these societies. There is no political culture that accepts pluralism. There is no political culture that accepts the concept of coalitions. I can give you a picture of a 50 women graduate from the Cairo University in 1950. One of them would probably be wearing hijab. Today, one of them will probably not wearing hijab. I doubt it. Secularism was acceptable. You had people like Salama Musa and all of these people, you know, writing stuff that they couldn't write today. They could not write today. Societies develop, but societies go backward. So now we are inheriting this world that is broken. The Middle East, folks, was broken before the Arab uprisings. It is still broken. And if you have any sense of history, you have to say things are bad today, but it is too early to come up with anything that is not tentative in terms of judging where we are going now. It took decades for the Arabs to reach this nadir. It's going to take years and probably decades to get out of this mess and to get out of this hole that we Arabs, we in the first place, not the Zionists, not the Israelis, and not the American imperialists or whatever. India became independent in 1948. Egypt became independent at the same time. In the early 1960s, GDP of Egypt was equal to GDP of South Korea. Look at South Korea today and look at Egypt today. You can rail against colonialism. You can rail against this and that. Or Israel. But what did Israel do to Algeria to stop Algeria's development, or Morocco's development, or Yemen's development, or whatever? You know? And you rarely find Arabs engaging in this kind of self-criticism. Now, I'm not saying that the Americans do a lot of self-criticism or introspection. Most people don't like to do that. But you know, we are people with old memories, and we remember, and when we, you know, in fact, my friend Abderrahim mentioned the Crusades. I mean, Arabs always complain about the West. Last year I went to Spain. I've always wanted to go to Spain. I went to Cordoba and I cried when I saw the flowering of Arab-Muslim culture there. I don't call it an invasion. I think the Spaniards were happy or lucky. Carlos Fuentes, the famed Mexican novelist, said, if the Arabs didn't invade Spain, Spain should have asked for an Arab invasion.
I think we have time for maybe one more question.
Thank you.
I think Richard wanted to have a question.
Well,
Yeah.
well, gentlemen, thank you for both coming today. You've been enlightening and even wise, which is very rare in my old business. Hisham, nice to see you again. I'm actually I didn't put my hand up this time because it's very similar to your question, but I'll try to narrow it down a little bit. We are, all of us here are in the business, in part, of trying to make people understand, if not like, American policy. And it's possible that they can like us and not like our policy and vice versa. But who is persuadable in the Middle East? There are some people that there's toxic anti-Americanism. I don't think there's anything that we can do to change that. But who are the people who we can speak to that might be amenable to understanding the American point of view and American policy?
And all you have to do is answer that in 5 minutes, because that's how much time we have.
Yalla, Abderrahim.
Okay.
Be brief, Abderrahim.
I'll be brief. anti-American sentiment, the way I see it and experience it, anti-American sentiment is not the reserved domain of any particular political sensibility in the region. Hisham was talking about Islamists. Some of them are anti-American, some of them are not, some of them are in the middle. Secular Arabs, the same. I think over the last 4 or 5 decades in the Arab region, some of the most vocal Americanists were secular. Mm. And I think that one of the lessons of what's happened in the region over the last 3 years is that neither the Islamists nor secular Arabs have a monopoly of the truth and of true decision-making. They both messed up. And I think what applies to that applies to anti-American sentiment. I think if you want to reach out, you have to reach out to a broad spectrum of players in the Arab region. And this is, in my mind, this is not an absolute. Because somebody who is anti-American today for whatever reason, tomorrow, because if the power changes, you know, they would change, or at least the way they express that sentiment would change. So there are no absolutes. But I am convinced that there is a whole plethora of different players that you could reach out to. Some of them within the Islamist sensibility, some of them within the secular sensibility, and some of them, and this is what we tend to forget, that the Arab world, the majority of Arabs, are neither Islamist nor secular. They live in that big wide middle that inherited Islamic practice from their fathers and their ancestors, and they do it in a way which is moderate, which is natural, which is instinctive. It's not political. It doesn't have any beef with the Americans or with the Europeans. You know, these people, they just want to get on with their lives, and they just want to live a decent life. And I think that provides a unique platform for the kind of effort that you are talking about.
Well, I think, did you have
just briefly, do you have time, or I'll let...
2 minutes.
Okay. Look, there are communities, there are Arabs who are willing to listen. I would focus on the small business people, because they should understand that we are part of a globalized economy. They understand America's role in the Middle East. I would talk about the students, talk about women groups. But I will speak consistently. That's the problem. We didn't do that. I remember how George Bush and Condi Rice, I remember interviewing Condi Rice and I, after her speech in Cairo, famous speech in Cairo, excellent speech in Cairo, and immediately when she criticized Mubarak and calling for essentially one man, one vote, and then we had elections in Palestinian territories, and Iraq, and in Lebanon, and in Egypt, and lo and behold, the Islamists took over, essentially, and the Bush administration recoiled. And they stopped talking about the reform agenda and the freedom agenda. These kind of contradictions will be used against you. You are not consistent. You're not politically consistent. And when you speak the same language, focus on the same values, and say the same thing, whether you're talking to military rulers in Cairo or religious, Islamists in other places, just speak the same language. And I think this is the role of the old embassies. When Ryan used to go there, and when the embassy was supposed to, reach out to people, encourage people to come to the United States, allow, fight for Americans to go there and study and live. Exchange programs are important. But essentially, there are people who would understand that economically and politically and strategically, their best interests lie in a good relationship with the United States. Not that we want to be a protectorate, not that we want to be under an American thumb or whatever, but that our interests are dictate that we should have a good relationship with the United States. I mean, the funny thing is that many of those who criticize the United States, they want to send their kids to America. When they get sick and they have money, they want to send their kids to the Mayo Clinic. I mean, themselves to, or whatever, to the Mayo Clinic. The United States, is true, as Abderrahim said, is not as powerful as it used to be in terms of influence events there. This was the case maybe during the Cold War. Now things are changing, and the priorities of each Arab country is changing. Fortunately or unfortunately, the Palestine issue is no longer the central issue that drives most Arabs. There are other local issues. The Egyptians are driven by their own, problems today. The Iraqis don't even care about Palestine or the Arab East. Morocco has its own Western Sahara issue. I mean, but essentially, maintain consistency and reflect the these values that worked before. It's not going to be easy. We're going through a difficult period. It's a transition. And again, I'll say this and I'll shut up and I again go back to my leftist background. Antonio Gramsci has a wonderful description of the mess that takes place during tradition. He says the crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old order cannot be dead completely and the new cannot be born yet, and in the interregnum a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. A great variety of morbid symptoms appear. When you look at the Arab world today, you see a great variety of morbid symptoms appearing. And we have to keep that in mind, take a historic look at it. As I said in my opening remarks about that memo, we've been there 60 years ago, 64 years ago. It's not going to be easy. But again, the United States, I always say, there are certain things only the United States can do, and the Arabs should know this. And only by virtue of being the United States. And call it the burden of empire, call it the burden of leadership. There is still a major role for the United States in that part of the world. And it's not only political, it should go back also to being important culturally. And to understand the same thing that those men and women, mostly men, who built the American University in Beirut in 1864.
A very good note on which to end. Hisham Melhem, Abderrahim Foukara, thank you for a fascinating and illuminating morning.
Thank you.
Let me add my thanks to Abderrahim and Hisham. We could have listened to you guys for hours and hours. And thank you, Ambassador Crocker, for putting that together and leading it. We're going to take a 5-minute or 10-minute break right now and reconvene to hear the other side, the MBN side from Brian and his team.
Thank you so much for coming.
Hisham.